In this video, I'm going to talk about expense reimbursements. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about reimbursing employees through payroll, through the payroll service. So for example, if they went to the store and bought office supplies and used their own debit card, then you might reimburse them by adding a tax-free reimbursement to their paycheck. Or sometimes there's cases where the employer will give a monthly allowance for telephone expense if the employee is using personal phones for business purposes. So basically what I'm going to talk about in this video is how to deal with that on the accounting side of things. How are those entries made in your accounting system? And I'm going to use the QuickBooks sample company to demonstrate this. Basically, to summarize how to treat these expenses, you're going to want to record the expense reimbursements in the expense category that the expense is related to. So if you're reimbursing an employee for office supplies, you would probably put that in an office supplies account. If you're reimbursing them for their phone, the use of their phone, then you would probably put that in a telephone expense account. If you're reimbursing them for parking, you might have a parking expense account, or you might put it in a travel expense account. Or if you're reimbursing them for, say, the use of their home office, then you might put a portion of that as rent expense. A portion of that might be utilities expense. It just depends on the situation. It depends on the expense type. And of course, it depends on your chart of accounts and what accounts you have. So I'm going to give you an example of this, but of course, just know that your specific situation might be different because your chart of accounts might be different. Now, one thing I do want to point out is some companies will create a specific account for expense reimbursements. So they might put all of their expense reimbursements in an account called something like this, expense reimbursements. However, I do want to point out that if you do this, then you will still need to be prepared at the end of the year to have an accounting of what those expense reimbursements were for. So if your expense reimbursements totaled $5,000 for the year, you would have to know the breakdown of how much of that was phone, how much of that was travel, how much of that was office supplies, and so on. So for this demonstration, what I did was set up a journal entry that would be similar to what you might see if you have a journal entry for a payroll. So this is a payroll where the gross wages were $4,000, payroll taxes of the employer were $500, tax withholdings, taxes payable are $1,500, and the net pay was $3,300, or the net payment out of checking was $3,300. And then I added some expenses. These are expense reimbursements that were given to employees. So employees were reimbursed $35 for office supplies, $125 for phone, $58 as a mileage reimbursement, which I did set up in this sample company as an expense account, and then $82 for parking. So this would be how you would handle the expense reimbursements. All you're doing is recording these expenses in the appropriate expense account with the amount of that expense or of that reimbursement. So that's how it would look in the payroll journal entry. It's just a debit to add to the expense accounts. Okay, so it's as easy as that. Now, I do want to point out that sometimes you're processing your payroll through a separate payroll service that syncs to QuickBooks. And when you're using a system like that, sometimes what will happen is that payroll service will only allow you to choose one expense account that maps to QuickBooks for those reimbursements. So for example, if you're using Gusto for payroll processing, I believe Gusto only allows you to map to one expense account. And then I think QuickBooks Online is the same way. I would have to check. So if I go to, it won't let me go to the payroll settings in this sample company. But basically what I'm trying to say is sometimes Let me go back. Basically, what I'm trying to say is sometimes the entry that's made for payroll, for whatever reason, because of syncing or the way it's set up, it only allows one account to be named. So in that case, what I usually do is utilize that expense reimbursement account. So this was what, a total of 300, but that's not going to give me a lot of good information when I run a profit and loss because I'm going to see a number in expense reimbursements and I don't know what those expense reimbursements are for. So what I would do is probably allow the payroll service to bring the journal entry in like this, but then I would do an adjusting entry to move that $300 to the appropriate expense accounts. So that's what I'm going to do real quick. So I'm going to save and close this. Okay, so I've got my payroll entry. Everything is now in this expense reimbursements account, but I want to move those expenses to the correct expense account. So I would create a journal entry. I would credit expense reimbursements to subtract the $300 out of this account. And then I would debit the correct expense accounts. Okay, so this is the adjusting entry to move reimbursements to correct expense categories or correct expense accounts. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save and close this, and we're going to look at the profit and loss. Now you can see here, just from this report, that it did subtract the $300 out of expense reimbursements, but let's look at the profit and loss to see how that looks. So we have expense reimbursements at 0 because I zeroed that out, and it shows the mileage reimbursement, the office supplies, the parking, and the phone. And then, of course, it shows the gross salaries, gross wages, and payroll taxes. So this gives me a better picture than if I had left. Let me go back to that second journal entry. If I delete this entry and then go back to my profit and loss, all that does is show me 300 in expense reimbursements, which isn't really giving me very much information of what that $300 was for. So putting it in the individual accounts is better because it does give you more information about the actual expenses of the business. And that's all I wanted to cover in this video. I do have other payroll related videos. If you check my playlist, you'll find a payroll playlist of videos with a lot of other information. And I do plan on continuing to add to that playlist as much as I can because I do feel like this is a topic that a lot of people ask questions about. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment below, and thank you for watching.